Hey Larry, it's great to see you. Just spoke on the phone one time. This book is really amazing, and I really enjoyed the way that you spoke on each one of these guys. These guys, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Count Basie, they're like my heroes, so it was really informative. What was the inspiration for you to write the book?
So before I answer your question, I want to just say, if there's anything that I would love to do in the world that I am very far away from ever being able to do, it is play the sax and play it like you did. The closest I came to that, I don't know if you know how the book festival, the Jewish Book Festival world works, but every year, my guess is a couple hundred authors, is it, that do the appearance? How many do tryouts?
The Jewish Book Council?
Yeah, Jewish Book
Over
Council.
200.
So over 200 authors get together, well, they used to get together in person in New York and Washington Square, and in the post-COVID era, they get together online. And every author is given exactly 2 minutes to make their pitch on why you ought to have them speak. And then festival organizers like Sarah, our wonderful organizer here, decide yay or nay, and it's generally nay. And so what you try to do in those 2 minutes, knowing that they're going to be exhausted, having heard 199 authors before you, is you try to figure out some way to do something memorable. And for my last book, which was a biography of a guy named Superman, at the end of my 2-minute presentation, I ripped my shirt open and had a Superman t-shirt embossed in a Star of David. And whether or not they liked me, they remembered me. And on this one, I tried to figure out what to do. And a friend lent me, I was in Washington doing some talks on something, and a friend lent me a saxophone. And the closest I ever got to playing a saxophone was holding it up as a prop in this book festival thing, but I didn't know how to blow a note. So I want to answer your question now, and the question was, why this book? And the answer is, if you'll indulge me, I want to take you back to a previous book. About 20 years ago, I wrote a book on some black men who worked on the railroads called Pullman Porters. And these were an extraordinary group of men who my book argued, in a way, set the table for today's black middle class. They were the best job that a black man could get in America for nearly a full century was as a Pullman porter. And the Pullman porters that I talked to, there were 20, probably actually 40 of them alive when I wrote the book. By the time the book was handed in to the publisher, there were 20 alive, and by the time it came out, there were almost none of them alive. But I made the Pullman porters 2 promises, that when I got done writing for them, I would someday write a book on their favorite athlete. And that was a guy, a baseball player named Satchel Paige. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I wrote a biography on him. But the real promise the Pullman porters wanted me to make was that someday I would write a book on their 3 all-time favorite passengers, who were 3 guys named Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. And the reason they were their favorite passengers says to me a lot about not just the porters and the jazz guys, but about what America was like in the era we refer to as Jim Crow, the era of segregation in America. And even if you, in that era, were a famous musician celebrated around the world like Ellington, Armstrong, or Basie, when you went south to perform, if you went into the wrong restaurant or tried to book a room in the wrong hotel, you could be beaten or you could end up at the end of a lynching noose. And that was enough of a real risk to these guys that what they did when they could afford it, and they could afford it for much of their long careers, is they would rent a private Pullman sleeping car to take them south. And when they did a concert in a place like Atlanta, at the end of the night, rather than worrying where could I get a meal or where could I get a safe place to sleep, they went back to their private sleeping car. They knew they had a luxury bed made up for them by the Pullman porters. They had a great meal made for them by the amazing dining car staff. And most of all, they had a safe haven. And what they did in return was, in that closed capsule of the railroad car, in the middle of the night, they would do a private jam session just for the Pullman porters. And I don't know about any of you, but if I could go back to any moment in history, it would be having the Duke Ellington Orchestra perform just for me in the middle of the night.
Wow. Yeah. So you wrote it for the Porters.
So I wrote it for the Porters, and I want to just actually say one other quick thing. I was also possibly, if we took a survey in this room, I may have known less about jazz and less about music than anybody in this room. But I had spent most of my life as a daily journalist, and one of the things that you did most days when you went into a newsroom is you were given an assignment to do a story on something that you probably knew nothing about. And the assumption was if you had a whole day and you could talk to a lot of smart people, by the end of the day, you could say something worth readers reading. And at the end of my day, writing about these jazz musicians, I talked to 250 people. And they included extraordinary people like Wynton Marsalis and Sonny Rollins and John Batiste, three great jazz figures. And had I gone to them and said, I'm a smart journalist or author, and I know what I'm doing with this book, and I just want a quote from you, they would have hung up the phone. If you go to them and say, I'm a dumb journalist, and I have promised my publisher I'm going to write a book that does justice to these three jazzmen, they took all the time that I wanted. They gave me, it was impossible to reach them, but once I got them on the phone, they gave me their cell phone numbers, and they said, call any time. And with Sonny Rollins especially, I took him up on that offer and called endlessly.
That's amazing. Do you have an idea of like each one of these amazing men? What was the trait of Duke, Louis, and Count Basie? Were they able to like put together these big bands and make it happen?
So it's different traits, and if I could, I'd like to take you just back very quickly to the beginnings of each of them, which said a lot about who they became and how they put together their bands. And I'd like to take you back first to a neighborhood in New Orleans that was so tough it was known as the Battleground. And that's the neighborhood that Louis Armstrong grew up in. And he was rescued, much like Satchel Paige had been rescued in Mobile by being thrown into reform school. Louis Armstrong was rescued by, at the age of 13, on New Year's Eve, when he shot his stepfather gun up in the air just as part of the celebration. He was grabbed by a detective and tossed into reform school for 18 months. And he would later say he traded 18 months of freedom to learn how to play the trumpet. He watched lots of his teenage friends who he had hung out with on the streets in New Orleans be killed before they ended their teenage years. And he said that saved his life. He learned first how to play a bugle, because that was what they used to get kids up every morning. He then learned how to play a cornet, and it was ultimately a trumpet. And he never forgot those kinds of roots that he had come from. And I don't know about you, but I felt like every time I listened to Louis Armstrong, and I loved being able to call it work, listening to Louis Armstrong. Every time I listened, I felt like I was watching his heart come out of the end of that trumpet, and his voice, which was so incredibly heartfelt. And he remained a kid from the streets of New Orleans with that incredibly human connection and with that bigger than any part of his body heart for the rest of his life. A long way away from there, from New Orleans, we're now going to travel up to Washington, D.C., where a kid named Duke Ellington grew up. And he grew up, unlike Armstrong, who was in a very poor environment and ended up in reform school. Ellington grew up in the middle of the largest black bourgeois community in America, which was Washington, D.C. And to me, the emblematic moment of his childhood, which sort of said who he was and what he was going to become, was every morning when he would come down the steep staircase of his very nice home in Washington. At the bottom of the stairs would be all of his relatives. They were getting ready to go to school or doing whatever. And he would say to his young nephews, "You should bow to me." He would say to his young nieces, "Curtsy," and he would say to all of his adult relatives, "Someday the world is going to know me as the great and the grand Duke Ellington." And he used to tell lots of interesting different stories on where the nickname Duke came from, but don't believe any of them. He crowned himself a Duke, and he proved for the rest of his life that he was worthy of that aristocracy. There was an elegance to him in everything from his dress to his style that was entirely different than what Louis Armstrong had done, and yet made him an extraordinary on lots of levels. I'm convinced that Ellington would have gone down in jazz history if all he did was play the piano. But he played the piano, he was an extraordinary band leader, he was an arranger, and he was a composer. And he composed more songs. There's a great debate whether it was 1,000 or 5,000 or how many thousands. And I tried to, as an old-fashioned journalist, look at every source and see if I could come up with my own number. And I think we came up with 5,000 songs that Duke Ellington composed. Wow. And that was quite amazing. We're going to now move. We've come from New Orleans to Washington, and we're going to head north. And we're going to go to a place named Red Bank, New Jersey. Anybody here ever been to Red Bank? Great. Well, I want to say to you that, no offense if anybody who raised their hand is from Red Bank, but I want to say if you haven't been to Red Bank, don't bother going, because the main thing that you should know about Red Bank, New Jersey, is that Count Basie grew up there. And even Count Basie, who grew up there, spent his childhood figuring out a way to get the heck out of Red Bank. He thought about joining the circus because he was so desperate to get out of town. He realized eventually that he could play the piano better than just about anybody. And he grew up in an environment that was not as segregated by law as where Louis Armstrong grew up. But as anybody who grew up in that era anywhere across America knows, it was by fact as segregated. And what blacks could do were limited enough that Count Basie's mother was a laundress and his father was a gardener for wealthy whites in Red Bank, New Jersey. And he eventually got out of Red Bank, went to New York, where he trained, and again, this is literal, he trained at the feet of the great Fats Waller. And when I say literal, I mean that he spent a good part of his time watching Waller play an organ, and he was watching his movement with the pedals on the organ. And he ended up becoming astounding enough at doing the piano, but even more, Duke Ellington was a composer, and the world will know him either as a composer or as a piano player. Count Basie, while he played a great piano, will be known as what I think was maybe the best band leader in the history of jazz. And it was because he had much less of an ego than Duke Ellington, and he was willing to give enough to his fellow band members that everybody loved playing for Count Basie more than even for Duke Ellington.
Wow. I look at these three gentlemen, and it's like I feel like about a lot of great artists in any field is they almost seem like they're from another planet. Especially those three guys, the time they came up and what they had to go through, and then to have these bands and just ended up traveling around the world. When you read this stuff, it's like, when they did this, it was almost impossible for them to do it, but they did it. And the connection between them and the managers, who happen to be Jewish, I always think about when we do this, and when you're in art, you rise above everything. It's like, this is another person. He digs the music, he can play the music. That's all that matters,
So can I say a word about the Jewish-black connection in the world of jazz? And that was a connection, it was partly that both Jews and blacks in that era had a tough time making it to places like the elite WASP symphony orchestras. And for the same reason that Jews were disproportionate in a previous book that I wrote in composing great comic book characters, because they couldn't get jobs writing for the fancy magazines, Jews, like blacks in that era, had to look for a new way to express their musical genius. And the form that was most open to them was the most all-American new form that was being invented, called jazz. And so Jews and blacks flocked there in amazing numbers. It was true that Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie all had Jewish managers. They also had Jewish bandmates, and they had Jewish friends. But the one who had by far the strongest connection to the Jewish world was Louis Armstrong. And I don't know whether you know, there's a lot of versions of this story out there, and some of them are actually true. And the story is that when Louis Armstrong was a kid in New Orleans, there was a family named Karnofsky, a family of Lithuanian Jewish origins that were rag salesmen, or as my grandparents would have called it, they were schmutty salesmen. And they did what Jews did in those early days before they could afford their own stores. They went with their rags all across the city trying to sell it. And the Karnofskys were smart, and they realized, how do we compete with all these other rag salesmen out there? What if we had somebody tooting a horn and drawing attention to what they were doing? So they went in and bought Louis Armstrong a very cheap horn, and he blew it, and he did in fact attract people to it. And they were so taken with him, and he, growing up in a household with a single mother who had a very difficult time providing for the family, he would go home at night with the Karnofskys. He would have the Lakshan Kugel or whatever Lily was cooking. He would listen to her lullabies, and he was most intrigued of all by listening to the men in the family davening. And he said that the influence of the Jewish lullabies, but even more of this strange sound of men doing this rhythmic davening, became part of what he was creating in the jazz world. He took influences from blues, he took influences from his mother's church, but he also took it from the Jewish world. And he showed his fealty to the Karnofskys by the rest of his life wearing around his neck a Star of David. And he wrote 3 memoirs. And the third memoir he dedicated, as he phrased it, to the Jewish family from New Orleans. And he was in love with them. And they were as much parents to him, he felt, as the father he never knew in his life, and as the mother who he adored. And the one last thing I want to say about that is, I think whatever your politics are, I think there is resonance to the black Jewish story that continues today. The black-Jewish alliance that we took for granted in the last century, in recent years has had lots of reasons why it is frayed. But one of the things that I hope is if we look back to the history of jazz, we will realize that blacks and Jews share so much more than keep them apart, and that we can reconstruct alliances like that as we look to our future in this country.
Well, that's beautiful. I remember we spoke about the power of the Salem Willows. I was wondering if you could speak on that. We were talking about the 2 brothers that owned because that's how I started the festival, is reading, while reading Music is My Mistress by Duke Ellington. His chapter on Salem, Massachusetts. And I was blown away, and then we spoke over the phones. Can you?
We did. So we spoke, and Sarah was with us, and that phone call inspired something that may get me into trouble here, but I think that the family that was doing lots of jazz booking all across the North Shore, if anybody is old enough to remember a family named Shribman, who are from here. Anybody know the Shribmans? So David Shribman's a famous journalist today, and there are, his father and his uncle, Charlie and, who was he? I'm trying to remember the brother's name, but 2 Shribmans did bookings at Willows and all around here. And when I say it got me in trouble, after you and I talked about that and you inspired my memory of the Shribmans and what they did here, I sent an email to David Shribman and I said, we were just talking about your dad and your uncle, and I said, you should do a book on them. And of course, his response is a response anytime you suggest that. He says, no, you should do a book on that. And we ended up settling on the fact that we're going to collaborate at least on an article on that. And that is bad news to my publisher, whom I owe a new book much too soon, but it would be very fun. And I think doing it, they represented exactly the black-Jewish alliance that we were talking about. They were bringing in Ellington and Armstrong and Basie. And the reason, if you don't know, not just that everybody loved the North Shore here, but the reason big jazz musicians like Ellington and Armstrong and Basie came here was during the summer, it was ungodly hot in New York City, and everybody wanted to get the heck out of New York if they could. And what better place, if you were getting out, than to come and do a tour on Cape Cod or the North Shore, or go up to Salisbury Beach and the old Frolics nightclub, and go up to Old Orchard Beach, and that's precisely what they did. They went just where their fans were going, which was to places that were cooler and were cool. And it was an amazing thing, and New England got, during the summer, the best music in America.
Duke Ellington summered out of Salem Willows for 22 years.
Amazing.
It's amazing. Also, the connection with the North Shore. I came up here because there was a lot more places to play music. And I read this book by a local author about Essex, Massachusetts. In that book, he writes about when they had their first train that went from the Continental Fairgrounds, or like a place where people go on picnic. This train would go from there to Boston. And so his idea, he saw so many people getting on this train, he decided to put a band on the train. And so people would get on the train because of this band, and that would be the draw. And I was just thinking, I think that's why I love it up here so much, is you all are really into great music and having a good time. So, is there anything else you'd like to cover? I mean...
Sure. So what I want to just say is that and we'd love to take questions from anybody, but what I would love to say is that the reason I wrote this book, knowing as little as I did about music, was because I was not trying to write the 200th book on Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie and say something original about their music. Much smarter people like you can do that, and I was trying to say these guys have another half to their legacy. And that half, to me, is at least as important. And that is that these guys, in a very profound way, set the table for the civil rights revolution in America. And I want to just explain to you briefly how I think they did it. And I can't prove this, but Martin Luther King thought it as well, so I think that gave me a little more confidence in saying it. And I think what they did was that white men of that Jim Crow era in America, who would never have let a black cross their threshold, wooed their sweethearts, their wannabe wives, with the extraordinary music of the Ellington and Armstrong players. That white women who, if a black man had walked towards them on the sidewalk, would have walked to the other side of the street. When they got into the privacy of their own living room, they kicked off their heels and they tapped their toes to the incredible music of the Count Basie Orchestra. And by the way, with Basie, they used to say that if you didn't tap your toes to him, then there was something anatomically wrong with you and you ought to go see a doctor. But my point is that for once, race fell to the wayside, and if these men could create the kind of genius that they did with their music, that it dawned on people slowly but surely that maybe they deserved equal rights. And Martin Luther King said, if it were not for these jazzmen, it would have taken years and maybe a generation longer to do all that he did in trying to lower barriers of Jim Crow. So if there's anything that I would ask all of you is that next time you listen to a song from any of these three greats, realize that while they would tell you that we speak through their music, they spoke much louder than their music in a way that transformed this country.
Wow.
Question is great.
Great,
Please.
thank you so much. Any questions from the audience? I'll run around with the mic.
I was wondering, sometimes when you're writing, I know what happens when I write, all of a sudden you come at the end and you find something you really didn't expect, that it took you on a journey. And I was just wondering if there's anything you found towards the end that surprised you.
I did. I want to just say one thing about the process of writing. Writing a book is the same as writing a daily story for a newspaper, except you got a lot more material. And at the end of my process, I was very naive. I went into a book about 3 people thinking I only had to do a third of the work on each of them. And you realize that nobody cares whether only a third of your book is about Louis Armstrong. They want you to know Louis Armstrong as well as if you had done a whole book. So I did exactly 3 times the work I'd done on any previous book. And when I print it out, my process is printing out all the notes that I took when I was reading articles and books, and then all the notes of my 250 interviews. And there were 8,500 pages of notes. And so organizing is the challenge. But the fun thing is along the way doing exactly what you said, finding things, directions that you're taken in that you never anticipated. And the best story to me about a direction unforeseen was I knew a lot about, and everybody had written a lot about Duke Ellington. The world knew his story. Everybody had written a lot about Louis Armstrong, maybe one of the best known. They used to say that the two best known American symbols of popular culture in the world were Mickey Mouse and Louis Armstrong. Everybody knew Louis. But very few people knew Count Basie. He was an enigmatic figure and liked to be behind the scenes, which is perfect if you were going to be a band leader and let your musicians shine. But it was very difficult to figure out who he was. And I'm convinced I'm one of 3 people on the planet who read cover to cover his memoir because it was deadly. It was like a travelogue. And I'm convinced he wrote that, and any time he'd get to an interesting story, he'd say, I'm not going to share that. That's my private story. So it was a deadly book. So I wanted to find out a little bit more about Count Basie, and I turned to a source that I was skeptical about, which was genealogy. And I don't know who here is into that, but I had an incredibly smart genealogical researcher who went on and looked at Count Basie's story and came back with the fact that Count Basie had talked about having a brother, but he hadn't said much about this brother. The brother died at a young age. It turned out he had 2 brothers, one who died before his parents were married of malnutrition, who had been farmed out to somebody in the community, and I think what happened in Count Basie's life was the death of his 2 brothers, one of whom I think he only found out about himself at a later point in his life, made him feel like he had grown up in secrecy at home, and secrecy became part of his mode of operating in the world. And he was an extraordinary character, and the deeper I looked into him, the more I found out. Somebody gave me a trove of letters that he wrote to his wife over a period of about 30 years. And this was his beloved wife, who he regularly cheated on and who regularly in these letters threatened to leave him. And he would make promises, it's all over and I'm going to be a good boy, and that's exactly what he said, will you take me back? And they had a daughter who was severely disabled. And he would, when he knew his wife wouldn't read the letters, he would address the letters to his disabled daughter, knowing his wife was going to read the letters, and he tugged at her heartstrings in ways that he was amazing. And she did perpetually take him back, but she took him back each time with conditions. And when the 2 of them died, I realized somebody who became a friend was the executor of Count Basie's estate. And I realized that at a point about 20 years before he died, his wife had put all of their family assets in her name and the daughter's name. Because on the one hand, she took him back, and on the other hand, each time she took him back, she was sure he was going to do something bad again. And it was trying to peel back those layers and tell people. So I went to the museum at Rutgers University, this Institute for Jazz Studies, which has all of Count Basie's archives, and the people there were very nice to me. And I went to them at the end, just before the book was out, and said, you may want to take down the official biography you have online about Count Basie, because half of it's wrong. And they were gracious, and they corrected what was wrong. But that's the fun thing. You realize even if 50 people have written about somebody you're writing about, if you're intrepid, and if you're an old journalist who, thinks there's always something new to learn, there is something new to learn.
Thank you for all of this. This is wonderful. I remember in the 50s and 60s in particular that Armstrong was often criticized, even by other musicians, for being too much the entertainer, playing up to the audience. But recently, there's a documentary, which I haven't seen, but it sounds very interesting, which takes these, it sounds like thousands of hours of recordings he made, which showed him to be no pushover, not the sweet guy that entertained, but a very shrewd and angry person about the state of the world in America. Did that come out before you wrote this, and was it part of what you wrote?
So it didn't come out, but the story that they, I knew what they were doing with that, and the story that they told is a really good story. And it was a story that I had already been telling in the book, and it's Bruce. So Bruce is a great jazz musician from Canada, and I want to say just a word about Louis Armstrong, because he took the greatest flack. He was called sometimes an Uncle Tom, even less kindly an Aunt Jemima. He was basically seen as a guy who, in order to draw white audiences, was willing to do anything and ham it up. And the truth is he did ham it up, but he saw no contradiction between being an entertainer and being an artist. And you didn't have to tell a guy who had grown up in the center of Jim Crow America in New Orleans, Louisiana, what it was like to suffer racial indignities, because he suffered every one that you could possibly suffer. He went to a reform school that was called the Colored Waifs Home. I can't remember the exact title, but everything about his life said he knew the story of black struggle. And one day, when he was in a hotel room in some small town, he finally let it all out. He had had enough. And the year was 1954, and the big civil rights story, for anybody who has a memory, was Little Rock, Arkansas. And Little Rock was where 9 kids, one of whom just died a week ago, they were called the Little Rock 9. 9 kids were sent to integrate the all-white Central High School in Little Rock. And a racist governor named Orville Faubus, who was sort of a shade of what we would later know George Wallace to be, stood in the schoolhouse door and said, these kids aren't coming. And our brave war hero president, Dwight Eisenhower, said, I'm not doing anything about that. And Louis Armstrong had had enough. And a very young reporter came to him at his hotel room and said, what do you think about what's going on in Little Rock? And Armstrong let him have it, or let the public have it. He said, the governor is, and he used a word that I won't in this polite audience use, but it begins with M and it ends with R, and when it was ended up in the newspaper, it was translated into an uneducated plowboy. He called our war hero, President Dwight Eisenhower, gutless. And he was doing this, I think, for 2 reasons. One is because he believed every word he said, and the other was because he was tired of being unfairly called an Uncle Tom. Well, this story made headlines around the world, and the newspapers that had been calling him an Uncle Tom were suddenly calling him an unpatriotic American. He couldn't win either way, but there was one person in America who got the message, and that was the guy in the White House who adored Louis Armstrong. And I can't prove what I'm about to say, but I believe it with all my soul, that I think one of the reasons Dwight Eisenhower sent in the federal troops to protect the Little Rock 9 was because Louis Armstrong had called him out and he realized that Louis was right.
Any other questions? Anyone else?
No journalist questions? The one there, great.
This has been fascinating. Thank you. I'm curious just more generally about your writing process, how you go about spending enough time each day. I've always find it interesting hearing from authors how they get the books done and the approach that they take.
So I spent a lot of time before I wrote books asking people how they did their books. And an old pal who worked at, was a commentator at WBUR and had a sports show there named Bill Littlefield, told me about his process, which was he would write 4 pages a day. And if it took him an hour to do it, he would take the rest of the day off. And if it took him 12 hours to do it, he'd put in 12 hours. And I went to I did a panel at a biographers conference, and everybody in that room had a different process. My process is, and I shudder to think about this even as I say it, my process is that I wake up at an ungodly hour every day of about 3 or 4 in the morning, and before most of the world or before my wife wakes up, I've gotten in 3 or 4 hours of concentrated work on what I'm doing. And by the time I do that, because when I'm in the writing phase, I spend the first half of my deadline writing a book, and my deadlines used to be just 1 year, because that's all the Boston Globe would give me to write my first 3 books. Now I have the luxury of taking a full 3 years to write a book, and I spend the first half of that doing intensive research and not writing a word. And then I get nervous, and at a certain point when I realize I'm hearing the same story for the 3rd time, I sit down and try to make sense of it. And I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning because in the middle of the night, I don't know if anybody in this room ever remembers, it's been a long time since I smoked marijuana, but when you smoke marijuana, you have a sense that you are seeing the world with a clarity that somehow has gone away by the time, the marijuana wears off. But I would wake up with that kind of an experience in the middle of the night. I would have perfect clarity on what I wanted to say the next morning, and by the time I woke up in the next morning, if I slept till 7 or 8 o'clock, I would have forgotten it. So I try to wake up when I have this clarity and put it down on paper. And when you've spent a year or a year and a half researching a book, you can't wait to try to tell that story. And you should only take on, I had a very smart editor named Kirk Scharfenberg at one point at the Boston Globe, and Kirk told me you should never write a book that you can't not write. Meaning you're going to spend so much time and energy doing this that you've got to be totally passionate about it. You are going to live with Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie for 3 years, so you better like them, or you better hate them. The guy who I wrote a book on before Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie was a guy that you may remember named Joseph McCarthy. And I didn't exactly wake up every morning thinking I was in love with him, but I felt like I was passionate about what I wanted to say about him. And the toughest thing in writing a book by far is not the process that you were asking about. To me, the toughest thing is coming up with the idea and then selling your publisher that they ought to think it's as good an idea as you do. And I am so nervous about that when I get to the end of a book that now, even before I finish that book, before I sent in the Ellington, Armstrong, Basie book, I had already come up with a topic and sold it to my publisher for the next book. And I want to just take 1 word or 1 minute to tell you about the next book. The next book is a story that I've wanted to tell for the last 20 years, if not my entire life. And I grew up with the story of the Holocaust that I was taught being one that Jews went, and I'm going to use a horrible expression that I hate to use, but this was the expression, that they went like lambs to slaughter, that they went to their death passively. And in the research that I did for an earlier book on the Jewish diaspora, and in the stories I would hear in my family, which goes back to 7 generations of Rebbes and who had lost a lot of the family in the Holocaust, the story I heard was people resisting. Every way from spiritual resistance to picking up a gun and shooting it as armed resistance. And so I'm writing a book. The place that authors get more book ideas, nonfiction authors get more of their book ideas than anywhere else in the media, is by reading the obituary pages of the New York Times. Because every day these brilliant obituary writers there are 100,000 or 1 million people who die every day, and they're picking the 3 most interesting stories to write. And a year ago, there was an obituary that taught me the way into this story. And that was an obituary of a man named Adolfo Kaminsky. He was a Jewish teenage forger for the French resistance. And he may have been the best forger in the world at the time. And he was credited in his obit in the New York Times and in every other newspaper in the world with saving 10,000 lives. One forger who worked day and night saving 10,000 lives. And I'm becoming convinced as I do my research that that's an understatement. But I'm using his book. I'm writing a book called The Forger of Paris, Adolfo Kaminsky and Jewish Resistance to the Holocaust. And I'm convinced that there are extraordinary stories of resistance in the death camps, in the forests, in the underground, and in the Allied armies. And you probably all know that 1.5 million Jews served in the Allied armies, which was totally out of proportion to their share of the wider population. And Jews were fighting back everywhere. And so I've been, in the last few months, 3 times to Paris. And every time I go there and I talk to the historians and they're helpful, they say, you had to have been telling this book 20 years ago. It's too late. And in my last trip to Paris, when I interviewed another dozen survivors, the youngest of whom was 89 and the oldest of whom was 3 months from turning 100, each of them, in turn, gave me 3 other survivors to talk to. And much as I wish I had been telling this story 20 years ago, and just coming here today, I'm doing an 18-city tour of Jewish book festivals for this book. And in every city I'm going to, during the evening, I'm talking about Jazzmen, and during the day, I'm talking to Holocaust survivors. And while I've been here today, I heard about a guy named Khan, Khan, who's a survivor in your community. And it's a story of passion. It's a story that I think needs to be told to help move the needle that Jews didn't go like lambs to slaughter, or I would have gone like a lamb to slaughter. It's also trying for me to understand my personal question, which is what the heck would I have had the courage to do had I been there? And my answer to date is probably not much, not anywhere near the courage of all the people I'm reading about and talking to. And I'm sorry, that was long-winded and not specifically answering anybody's question. But there was one more question somewhere there that somebody had.
Any more questions? We have time for one more, okay.
Great.
Can you guys both talk about, I know that Louis Armstrong got a chance to play with Duke, but can you talk about some of the cross-pollination between the 3? And like, did they know each other well? Did they hang out? Did they play together?
I don't know.
So I want to give you my theory on that, and a lot of people who are smarter than me would disagree with me, but I'm still convinced it's absolutely true. I have in the book every instance where they played with one another. The 3 of them were never together, and Ellington Armstrong were together, and Basie and Ellington, I think. But your question is a natural one. It's the question my publisher wanted to know. Can't you tell more about what they were like when they were together? And they were almost never together. And when I asked jazz historians and people who know individually Ellington Armstrong and Basie better than me, they all had interesting answers. It was that they were playing in different places at different times, all kinds of long, complicated explanations. I think the explanation is much simpler. All 3 of these guys, even Basie, had enormous egos. And why would you ever, if you were Duke Ellington, want to share the spotlight with anybody? And yet the only person, or the only 2 people that Duke would have had to share a spotlight if they were on the same stage and had to share equal billing out front were Basie and Armstrong. So I think they all said 100 times, anytime a journalist would ask, incredibly nice things about one another. But it was partly that they were different people, and it was partly that they had the stage. And one reason I chose these 3, and there were lots of other people to choose, is all 3 of these guys did something that you will do with your band, but almost nobody does today, which is last a full half century at the top of their field. And can you imagine 50 years, if Britney Spears or Taylor whatever last, 2 years and 15 concerts, that's a big deal today. A half century. They started out in the era of, no trains flying in the air. And by the end, they were jetting around and playing with the Beatles. And can I end on one quick story? Do we have time for one quick story here? The story is, to me, the sign of how much Ellington Armstrong and Basie influenced not just the jazz musicians who came afterwards, but everybody, from classical music to rock and roll, is the Louis Armstrong Museum in Queens. And if you've never visited, you ought to go there, because it is his house. The museum is his house, with everything intact the way he lived in that house, including a bathroom with mirrors all over. He spent a half an hour every morning in the bathroom, lighting up a fat joint and getting high, and he loved being in his bathroom. But the Louis Armstrong Museum was having a fundraiser, and they wanted to get a guy who lived not that far away named Paul McCartney to do fundraising for them. And McCartney adored Armstrong, and McCartney said, I will do anything you want to raise money for you if you will do one thing for me. And that one thing was to lend him a Louis Armstrong trumpet for a weekend so he could blow the horn of the great Louis Armstrong. They lent him the trumpet. He lent them his name for the most successful fundraising they had ever done. And it was a statement of how Louis Armstrong, until the end of his life, at age, 68, he knocked the Beatles with Hello Dolly off #1 on the Billboard charts. He was amazing, and these guys were amazing, and you're amazing. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to do a shameless plug real quick. It's been an honor to be here and playing for you all. And Larry, so great to meet you. Thanks. Can you hold that for a second? So on February 7th, I started something 3 years ago that's turned into like an amazing event. It's called the Big Band Blast 3. And what I did is 3 years ago, I got this from the book too. They used to have in 1949 the big band battles at Carnegie Hall with Duke Ellington and the Thundering Herd. So I read about this. I'm like, I want to try this. So I called the Cabot 3 years ago, and they said, yeah, let's do it. So it's the Cape Ann Big Band, or actually the band now is Brass Fed Nation, 18-piece big band. We set up at the Cabot. I set up 2 18-piece big bands side to side. The other band is the Brian Thomas, Alex Lee Clark Big Band. These guys are some of the top musicians on the East Coast, and we second lined into the Cabot. We sold like 700 tickets. We march right up on stage, we sit up next to each other, and we play in battle. It's an awesome thing, and this is the 3rd year, and actually this year, the Cape Ann Big Band and Brass Fed Nation is run by Carlos Menezes Jr. out of Gloucester, and then Brian Thomas and Alex Lee Clark run the BTLC Big Band. Well, they're also amazing teachers, so we're going to start the show off this year with 2 high school big bands battling, and then we're going to come on and play afterwards. So it's February 7th at the Cabot, and so many people have gone to this over the past few years and said, like, Henley, that's amazing to see 36 guys on stage throwing down. It's pretty good. Thank you again.
Thank you all for coming out. Thank you again to Larry Tye for being here, Henley Douglas Jr. and his band, the Blue Note Sultet. Wow, yeah. I got it. Please stay and buy Larry's book. He'll be signing in the back. And join us for our next event, which is on Thursday, November 7th, with Elizabeth Graver and her novel Cantica, which actually just won the Massachusetts Book Award for Fiction. So, the what? Oh, and don't forget to buy raffle tickets too. So thank you so much. I hope you had a good time. It was nice to see everyone.